Hello, 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 and welcome to the Daring Woman podcast. So, before we get into today's conversation, I thought I'd share briefly what a daring woman is, just in case you didn't see the previous episode. I know some folks don't like revisiting what already has occurred, so I'm going to help us move forward. So, this is a daring woman, according to me. A daring woman is simply a woman who is willing to have the difficult conversations and honestly reflect on the totality of her life, what she believes, how she shows up, the good, the painful, the healed parts, and the places she's still growing. It's not that vulnerability comes without a cost or that she is unafraid. It's that she recognizes growth often requires us to confront ourselves honestly, ask deeper questions, and challenge the stories, beliefs, and perspectives that shape our lives. So now that we have that out of the way, I also want to acknowledge something else really quickly. Since we're discussing honesty, can I just say that talking to a screen still feels a little awkward to me sometimes. I think I'm a much better speaker in person where I can actually engage with people and feel the energy of a real conversation. And while we are on the subject of awkwardness, during my attempts to edit last week's episode by trying to blur this background behind me, I inadvertently opened a portal. So if you notice the background swirling in last week's episode, just know editing is not my gift, but I digress. Anywho, I want to begin today's discussion a little differently. I'm going to share a portion of a poem that I wrote some time ago. I'm not going to read it in its entirety, just the part that connects to today's conversation. So if you see me glancing to the right, it's because I'm looking at my computer. So the poem is The Stories We Tell. The stories we tell. The stories we tell often bear the truth of the pain from our past piled on from our youth. Like the writer with a pen steadied in hand, we begin to record every moment as carefully as we can, not realizing that some memories are fragmented and the picture incomplete. So we start filling in the gaps as best as we remember them to be. And now this story frames up everything you see, what you think about yourself and others becoming the basis for what you believe. But sometimes our memories lie and other times they hide. And that's what we'll be discussing today, the stories we create about ourselves after pain. Hi, I'm Dr. Latasha Pinkney, and this channel is all about perspective shifting. As a facilitator of belief transformation, I help others understand and make sense of their experiences so they can move their lives forward with clarity and intention. So whether you've been here for a while or you're new, welcome to the channel. Now let's get into it. One thing I've come to realize is how much the stories we create after pain shape the way we see ourselves. Not necessarily the stories we tell other people, but the quiet internal stories we begin believing over time. The ones that slowly begin shaping how we see ourselves, how we move through relationships, how we respond to disappointment, what we expect from other people, and sometimes even what we believe we deserve. In the last episode, I shared a childhood experience that led me to quietly internalize the belief that I was unwanted and that people leaving somehow reflected my worth. What I didn't realize at the time was that the belief itself would eventually begin shaping other areas of my life. Because the thing about stories created in pain is that they rarely stay connected only to the original experience. Over time, they become the lens through which we interpret ourselves. They begin influencing how we love, how we trust, what we fear, what we tolerate, what we avoid, and sometimes even the roles we take on in life. And I think for many years, I didn't fully realize how much that story had quietly followed me into adulthood. I think sometimes we imagine beliefs as thoughts that we consciously choose. But honestly, many beliefs form much more quietly than that. Sometimes they form through experiences, sometimes through repeated disappointments, sometimes through environments, and sometimes through what was said to us, and sometimes through what was never said at all. And over time, those experiences began creating internal narratives. Stories like, I have to prove my worth, I can't depend on people, hello, I have to hold everything together, hello again, my needs are too much. If I stop performing, people may stop valuing me. And what's interesting is that many of these stories initially develop as a form of protection, because at some point they helped us emotionally survive something. But what protects us in one season can quietly begin limiting us in another. I know for me, one of the places that showed up most clearly was in my need for achievement and productivity. For a long time, I don't think I fully realized how much accomplishment and worth had quietly become connected in my mind. Externally, it may have looked like ambition, responsibility, drive, always pushing myself, always trying to do more, always trying to handle things well. And to some degree, those things were absolutely true. I have always been driven. I care deeply about excellence. I care deeply about showing up well. But if I'm being honest, there were also seasons where slowing down felt emotionally uncomfortable because productivity for me had become tied to value. I remember periods in my life where even resting made me feel uneasy. I know some of y'all like y'all sleep, but I don't really like to nap. Not then, not now. It's just not a part of who I am. But resting made me feel uneasy, almost like I needed to justify my existence through what I accomplished for other people. Now, I don't feel that way now, but although resting is still difficult for me, I know that my existence is no longer tied, or not that it ever was, but that was what I was operating from, is that it was tied to what I accomplished for other people. And I think underneath all of that was a deeper story, honestly, that was operating quietly in the background. And that story was, if I achieve enough, maybe I'll finally be enough. Or if I become valuable enough to other people, maybe I won't be abandoned. And the difficult thing about stories like that is that after a while, they stop feeling like stories and they begin feeling like truth. Once a story becomes identity, we stop questioning it. I also think this is why some people struggle to rest, not because they physically cannot rest, but because somewhere along the way, their value became connected to productivity. So resting creates discomfort. Slowing down creates discomfort. Doing nothing can begin feeling emotionally unsafe, even when the body desperately needs it. And I think many of us experience this in different ways. So for some people, the story shows up in relationships. You're always overextending, always giving, always becoming what everyone else needs, sometimes fearing that if they stop being useful, they may stop being valued. For others, the story becomes hyper independence, which was definitely true for me. I got it. I'll handle it. I don't need your help. And while strength can be beautiful, sometimes hyper independence is not strength at all. Sometimes it's self-protection. Sometimes it develops because depending on people once led to disappointment. So now carrying everything along feels safer emotionally, even if it's exhausting. And honestly, I think motherhood exposed some of these stories in me too. In the past, I've spoken openly about how deeply I became to my role as a mother. My children weren't just people I loved. For me, motherhood was closely tied to my identity, purpose, love, responsibility, and what mattered most to me. And truthfully, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. Some roles are meant to shape us and are essential parts of our identity and sense of purpose. Motherhood itself carries with it profound responsibility, deep emotional connection, sacrifice, nurturing, protection, and unconditional love. But when my children began to get older and enter new stages of life, I realized just how much of myself had quietly become attached to being needed. And I think that realization forced me to ask more honest questions about who I was outside of what I provided for everyone else. Not because motherhood lacked meaning, but because sometimes we can become so consumed with caring for others that we lose connection with parts of ourselves in the process. And I think many of us do this sometimes with relationships, sometimes with achievement, sometimes with caregiving, sometimes with being the strong one, sometimes with constantly showing up for everybody else while quietly neglecting ourselves. And eventually, we begin living from those stories without even realizing it. Russian playwright Anton Chekhov wrote, "Man is what he believes. Though I have no definitive proof, I wonder if he borrowed the idea from Proverbs 23:7, which says, 'As a man thinks in his heart, so is he.'" And the older I get, the more I realize how deeply our internal narratives shape our lives, not just emotionally, but relationally, spiritually, mentally, and even physically. Because if a person quietly believes I'm not enough, they may spend years overcompensating, years proving, years striving, years tolerating less than what they deserve, years shrinking, years abandoning themselves emotionally while trying to secure love, validation, acceptance, or belonging. And I think one of the hardest parts of healing is becoming aware of our stories that have lived inside of us for so long that we no longer question them. We simply live from them, which is why I think perspective shifting matters so deeply. Because healing is not about denying painful experiences. Pain is real. Disappointment is real. Rejection is real. Abandonment is real. And I've had my fair share of them all. But pain can introduce a story without having the authority to define who you are. And I think one of the most compassionate things we can do for ourselves is to begin separating what happened from what we began believing about ourselves because of what happened. Maybe someone leaving did not mean you were unlovable. Maybe being overlooked did not mean you were insignificant. Maybe struggling did not mean you were incapable. Maybe needing support did not mean you were weak. Maybe the experience hurt deeply, but it shouldn't define the truth about who you are. Romans 12:2 speaks about being transformed by the renewing of your mind. And honestly, the older I get, the more I realize that transformation sometimes requires revisiting old narratives, beliefs, perceptions, and stories with greater awareness, compassion, and truth. Not shaming ourselves for what we believed, but becoming aware of it, questioning it, reframing it, and allowing ourselves to consider that perhaps we are more than the stories that pain created. And perhaps this is the invitation I want to leave you with today. Maybe many of us are carrying stories that quietly shape the way we see ourselves and move through life. Stories created in pain, stories reinforced through experience, stories that eventually became identity. But awareness creates the opportunity for change. And perhaps healing begins when we finally pause long enough to ask ourselves, is this actually the truth about who I am? Or is this a story I learned to survive? I want to thank you all for joining me today, for listening. I hope this resonated with you in some way. And if it did, please share your feedback. Please like, please subscribe, and please share with any and all who you think may benefit from these lessons that I share. Take care and hope to see you in the next conversation.